Hey everyone, Jaden here with Therapy Connections. Before we get into this video, I just wanted to put out a little warning that this video does contain discussion of suicide and self-harm. If this is something that is triggering to you or something you struggle with, please reach out to someone you love, a mental health professional, a county crisis line, or call 988. Thanks for watching. Hello everybody, thank you for joining us for today's episode. We are really excited to have Jeff Denning here with us. He's awesome. We've got to know him a little bit over the last little while, but I will let him tell you about him. So take it away.
All right. Well, I guess first I'm old, so I have a lot of experience. But I don't know that. So I retired from Salt Lake City Police Department, and I've done other stuff for, let's see, I was 25 years before I retired, and then I got into mental health counseling. Currently I'm the chair of the Utah Critical Incident Stress Management Team for the state, and we help out with debriefings for first responders all over the state, including, I was looking at the list this morning, including a handful of just horrific suicides. I was a negotiator, first was trained as a negotiator by the FBI in the 90s, and then I got a bunch of other training and a whole lot of experience. So I've negotiated with dozens and dozens of people on different call-outs, and then literally hundreds of people who are suicidal. Not only those who have attempted suicide or wanted to kill themselves, but those who have completed suicide as well. So as a investigator and a police officer and a detective under a crisis for the crisis intervention team, I have a handful of experience reading suicide notes, investigating suicides, and talking to people who are in massive crisis. Not that only, but my little brother took his life a couple of years ago. And before that, for several years, I actually went around and I taught first responders about suicide. Different things that think about suicide and how to especially do the prevention, the intervention, and then postvention for suicide, and creating programs within their agencies. So whether it's peer-to-peer, for instance, I read statistics the other day that said that 54% of law enforcement officers, law enforcement officers are 54% more likely to take their life by suicide. And we know with firefighters and police officers that they're more likely to take their life by suicide than in the line of duty. So it's a huge thing. It's kind of interesting because first responders, dispatchers, firefighters, and police officers going to and responding to those incidents where people are suicidal, they're attempting suicide, or have completed suicide, they're exposed to it all the time. So I've kind of taught those individuals who already have a good grasp on that how to deal with it, how to help others in the community, how to help themselves, and how to help their peers. Because I'll tell you this, it's way different when you're negotiating with or helping counsel somebody who is a friend or a family member than it is somebody you don't know at all.
For sure.
So that's just kind of, I have a couple of master's degrees. One of them's clinical mental health counseling.
Just a couple.
Yeah, here's the thing. I wanted my wife to say, "Hey, just call me master," and so I'm like, maybe two. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Well, you mentioned something very, now that I'm thinking about it, very sobering before we started this, and that was the statistic that just in the period of time that we'll be filming this, there will be, I think, 6 people who have taken their life.
Yeah. So, in some of the statistics, there's a suicide every 11 minutes. So, there's going to be a handful. It's interesting in the United States, there's about 47,000 completed suicides annually. And that's like taking a giant NFL stadium and just killing everybody, holding a gun to their heads and killing themselves. Every single one of them. That's very sobering. In fact, it's shocking and horrible. And I think in even talking about this, I think, oh, the pain that other people are feeling, that's awful. Mm-hmm. Suicide is a leading cause of death worldwide. This is awful. And I don't remember the exact ages, but it's one of the leading causes of death in the United States. Mm-hmm. That's awful.
For sure.
And it's changed dramatically over the last several years because it wasn't like that in the past. It just wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know the full causations, and that's something we could talk about. But
Yeah, but this is a big issue, and I think it's an important one to talk about, especially, you know, this month of September is Suicide Awareness and Prevention Month, correct?
yes.
And so I'm glad that we get to talk some about this. One of the things that I've noticed is that it's not that all of us don't know that suicide is a huge issue in our world and in our country. And it's not that we don't want to address it. I just think that so many of us don't know what to do, don't know how to address it. And it feels scary. And so, you know, even in the past, sometimes like people were given the advice of, if you know somebody who is feeling suicidal, like don't talk about it, don't ask about it, because if you ask about it, you're going to give people ideas, right?
Yeah.
That was something that people believed in the past, and research has really showed that that's not the case, right? That's not
Yes.
necessarily what we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, we definitely need to talk about it. So I'm honored that you're having me on today, and I'm glad we can talk about it because you have to talk about it. You have to talk about it.
Yeah.
You can't not talk about it. In fact, one of the things that's really important for whether you're a parent or whether you're just a human being in general, if you suspect somebody's not feeling well, or even if they are feeling well, if I ask somebody if they're going to kill themselves, it doesn't put the idea in their mind. It doesn't say, well, you know what? Actually, maybe I should kill myself. No, it won't do that. Just talk about it. Ask people, and we could talk about that later on. But I think a lot of it has to do with what do we think personally, or as a society, what do we think about suicide?
Mm-hmm.
This leads a question that I've been having as we've talked about this. How normal are suicidal thoughts? Because I almost wonder, in my experience in working with people, there's a couple of things that seem to stand out to me to be the heavy hitting contributors to suicide, right? If you experience depression, if there's a belief that I'm a burden to others, if there's a loss of hope that's future oriented, those seem to be like the two big things I see that make suicide a possibility. But I'm finding, I think lots of people just have suicidal thoughts. So I'd be interested in what you guys think, like how common are suicidal thoughts? Does that mean there's something wrong with me and I'm actually suicidal and I'm going to go down that road? I need to go to the hospital? Like, I'm just open to your thoughts on that.
Well, I would say maybe right up front we need to say, hey, if somebody is feeling suicidal and they need help, if you are feeling that way, or if you know somebody's feeling that way, call 988. That National Suicide and Crisis Hotline is a good option. They could also call 911. You know, have police, and we could jump into that. But Josh, I think you hit the nail on the head with a lot of the things that you're saying. The loss of hope. But all those things, or that they feel that they're a burden, that compounded with alcohol use or drug use, that it exponentially increases depression and sadness, and then a greater loss of hopelessness. So that's a big problem. But a lot of people turn to alcohol, which is a depressant, and it's a mood destabilizer. And so, in fact, just because I know the statistic, 90% of firefighters and police officers who take their life by suicide have alcohol on board when they do the autopsy. 90%. So, you know, if you're depressed and not feeling well and you're feeling suicidal, don't drink alcohol. Don't do those things that are going to lead to more negative behaviors.
Sure.
Yeah. You know, Josh, and when I think some too about your question, you know, how many people struggle with suicidal thoughts, I think that sometimes we give this impression that if someone is having suicidal thoughts, that's like totally abnormal, when really I don't think it's that abnormal. I think this is a pretty normal response for our body and our brain to have when we're in a situation and we feel stuck, right? When you feel stuck and you feel like you can't get out of something that you're in, you're suffering, your brain is looking for any out possible. And sometimes that out does turn to suicide thoughts. The thoughts themselves don't necessarily have to be hugely problematic. especially if you can recognize like, oh, this is my brain trying to find a way out, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to take my life, but it does mean that I'm feeling stuck. It does mean that I'm trying to find a way out. Sometimes people don't talk about their suicidal thoughts because they're so concerned that this means that there's something so wrong with them. And instead, I think it would help to normalize this a little bit. Lots of us have these kinds of thoughts, and it doesn't always lead to this outcome of somebody taking their life.
100% right. And I've talked to a handfuls of different people and who said, after asking them about suicide, they say, I don't want to kill myself, but I also want to go to bed and just not wake up. I don't want to live anymore. And so, that's that position where you described it, Shara, is just like being stuck, just feeling numb and maybe hopeless. And I think it's very normal for us all to have periods where we just don't feel well on occasion, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's also important, I think, to keep in mind if you're feeling down, the part of your brain that problem solves tends to shut off. So when the emotional pain gets really high and the cognitive thought processes tends to take a lunch break, that's when those emotions start to take over. And so we may not be making the most important decisions well, which I think is why it's so important to talk about it. Because the number of times that I've met with clients where they're like, I'm just a burden, or my kids would be better off with different parents, or things like that. And I sit back in my chair and I'm just aghast, because I'm like, you seem like a great parent. All the things that we talked about, you'd be fun to be around. And so it's probably a sign that their brain is out for a lunch break and that emotional pain is so high. So it's important to remember that just because we have those thoughts, that doesn't make us super weird or way out there. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think along that line of thoughts, seeking help can be so beneficial sometimes, because I believe we can kind of, if you keep it in your head, you can kind of convince yourself of anything. And if you like that you're not a good parent, that your kids will be better off with a different parent or something like that. Where if you can get those words out of your mouth and get in front of somebody and talk about that, I think it becomes easier to combat some of that. Where if you just let it sit and fester in your own brain, it just will continue to get worse, because there's nothing to challenge that. Our brains are good at convincing themselves of things.
Yeah. We often believe what we're telling ourselves just because we're the one telling ourselves, and that's speaking out loud is good.
Right. Jeff, I would wonder, what other things would you say lead people to having suicidal thoughts, or make people more likely to take their own life?
I think just stress. So I don't think that people who take their life by suicide want to die. They just don't see any other way to go on. They don't see how their pain can be gone. So in even chatting with somebody, I couldn't say, hey, you know what, everything's going to get better. No, because they can't see that. They're stuck in a dark tunnel with no light on the end. And so I might be able to see something, but if I say it like that, hey, you know what, hang on, it's going to get better. It might not be better. There might be things that people are stuck with, that are struggling with, and it just might be there for a while. And that's just okay. So I think when we talk about the normalcy of the suicidal thoughts, it's interesting, because from person to person, it might be normal to have suicidal thoughts all the time. Unfortunately, that might be a normal thing for some people. So I think when we start to assess somebody, we need to figure out, is this a normal thought for you? Have you tried suicide in the past? Because those who've tried suicide in the past, or who have had parents who died by suicide, that also can be a increase of risk. So we can also look at suicide and say, okay, 95%, and I just chucking this from the hip there, but suicide is a personal choice. And so it's a mental health, a mental illness issue, even if it's immediate and temporary. Just saying, okay, you know what, I'm done, I'm going to take my life by suicide. It's mental. And so if we take that structure and say, okay, do we take the biology, excuse me, and the mental thought process and the environment, what all plays a factor in that? Because there are, if you look in the DSM, I think there's a couple. I think schizophrenia and bipolar, it increases the likelihood of suicidality or borderline personality disorder. So in dealing with individuals like that over the years, I've seen more. Then you get people who might be cutters, which is way different than saying, okay, I just want to die. They might feel that they want to die, but they want the pain to end. And so cutting, what I've seen, is superficial. It doesn't mean that they're going to kill themselves. They might, but usually people who cut, it's not going to kill them. So we got to taking the big scene approach and just saying, okay, well, what is it that's driving that? I don't know. What are your thoughts? I don't even know if I answered it.
I have a question, because in my mind I'm thinking about the people who might be watching this, and I'm thinking of it might be beneficial to talk about what we should look for, but I'm going two routes. What should I look for in myself, and what should I look for in a loved one? And then maybe we talk interventions after that. Do you guys have a preference on which route we go?
I think we can kind of throw them together.
Both?
Yeah,
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. So maybe let's do that. Let's talk some about what are some of the things or the warning signs that we would be looking out for.
I think number one is isolation. Isolation and withdrawal, always, always, always. If you're pushing people away, why? The very thing that we need to heal is people, oftentimes. But sometimes if we're depressed or we're not doing something, we actually need to get out and do something and be around people. And that might be the very hard thing to do. But sometimes it's just taking that hurdle and being around people. So sometimes if people withdraw or they act differently or they, again, get engaged in substance use of some term or some thoughts or some activities. And often those things that are done either alone or in private that can drive somebody into some deep depression and maybe even some suicidal thoughts.
Yeah. I would also say one of the things that is helpful to watch out for is some of this, because sometimes we do take these thoughts in our head and we speak it out loud, but we kind of just speak it out loud as like a tester, right? We put it out there like, I don't know, I'm not that great. Nobody really needs me around, right? And of course, everybody's reaction is to jump in and, oh no, you're wonderful. There's no reason you should feel like that. But I would say if there's somebody in your life who's throwing out some of those comments, almost trying them out, I think that would be a good thing instead of just trying to sweep that right under the rug, right? Maybe this is something we should recognize as being a warning sign and instead get a little more curious about it. Hey, I noticed you've been saying stuff like that lately. What's going on? What's got you thinking that, right? So maybe even some of those comments or some of those thoughts about being a burden, life being hopeless, not being good enough, people throwing out those kinds of comments, maybe that could be a sign that we would watch for as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I think it's also important, like maybe from the perspective of the person who is noticing this in somebody else, or maybe you meet lots of people who know someone who has completed suicide or attempted suicide that there was no signs, I didn't see anything. And I think that gets kind of tricky because then we feel like we should have seen something or we should have noticed. But I like the way you put it. I think you said immediate and temporary. Sometimes those come on so fast and there aren't a lot of signs. And I think it can be difficult to manage as the person who knows the person who is maybe having those suicidal thoughts if you didn't see anything.
Right. And unfortunately, that is pretty common, where there may be some signs only afterwards that you realize, oh, that's what I saw, only after the fact, and you can't blame yourself. That's the thing. It's still the individual's choice who takes their life by suicide. You cannot control that. You cannot. And you shouldn't be, well, I should have, I would have, I could have done this. And what it does is it just eats you alive. Mm-hmm. And you can't. You just have to say, it is the way it is, and the person who took their life, it was their decision, inevitably, even if they were not in their right frame of mind. And I'd have to say that anybody who takes their life by suicide is not in their right state of mind. And we can't judge somebody based on that mistake that they made. If somebody's had a lifetime of just goodness, well, we can't just say, hey, well, guess what? They took their life by suicide. Everything good they did was bad. No.
Right.
There was one thing I was reading earlier that I found interesting that I hadn't put a lot of thought into, so I'll throw it out here, see what you guys think. You'll see mood fluctuations, and one of the things that this article suggested was a sign might be when someone is having mood swings. And if you think about it, if you've got a lot of stress going on, like you said, Jeff, and you can't find a way out, financial problems, marital problems, employment problems, if you're really, really stressed, you're probably a little bit irritable. You probably isolate, et cetera, et cetera. And the suggestion that they made is when you see someone go from a transition of those kinds of feelings, of irritability, mood swings, to all of a sudden they're calm and they're happy. And I hadn't put a lot of thought into it, but as I think about it, once you make the decision, this is what I'm going to do to solve my problem, I can imagine there being a calming effect.
Sure, there's some peace in that.
Yeah, or they've given away all their possessions, and then they say, okay, hey, and there's really, at times like that, there may be nothing that you could do. They've made their mind up 100%, and you don't have any control over that. Yeah, that's unfortunate.
So that might just be something worth watching if you see somebody whose life seems quite stressful and chaotic, and then all of a sudden it's not.
All of a sudden they're giving possessions away. All of a sudden they seem a bit calmer.
Yeah.
All
Maybe
of a sudden
making
they seem
comments.
Yeah, not so stressed.
Comments like you said of, oh, it's going to be better before too long. Something like that.
Sure.
Yeah. Drastic change either way would be worth noting.
Well, here's the thing about distress that I've found. I think that if our expectations are one way and the reality is another way, if you were to put it on a graph, the expectation being straight up and down, like here's what I expect, here's my hopes, my dreams, and then reality is like it's veering off to the right at a 45-degree angle. That throws people for a psychological loop. Mm-hmm. You say, wait, my life I wasn't expected to be in this situation right now. I wasn't expected to lose a job or lose a kid or be going through a divorce or whatever else is happening. And that can add a great, anyway, it's psychological burden. You say, okay, how can I work out of this situation? Mm-hmm. But often, I think in recent years, people are thinking, okay, maybe suicide. Why? Is it because we're getting the message of suicide so frequent in media and pop culture, in news, and then you hear about it because in teaching classes years ago, I used to say, okay, hey, stand up if you, I have everybody stand up, and then I sit down if you have a family member who's killed themselves, or sit down if you have a coworker who's killed themselves. And honestly, there's a good number of people that have sat down. Or you say, well, do you have a friend or a close friend that has killed themselves? Pretty much everybody knows somebody, and if not, they know somebody who knows somebody who's taken their life by suicide. So I wonder if a constant barrage of thinking, okay, just take your life by suicide, has just gotten into our minds.
Yeah, well, and, I wonder too sometimes about the family and community response to something like this when it happens, because on one hand we don't want to judge the person who has completed suicide. We can't judge their emotional state and where they were at. And then on the other hand, sometimes there's almost this like a glorification or this feeling that some of my clients have talked about, that they have a family member who has died by suicide, and suddenly everybody is talking about that person and remembering great things about that person, and that person is getting all of this love and attention and affection that they never got, and sometimes even those responses, I think, can be almost harmful in some ways to other people who are feeling so alone and feeling worthless and unnoticed. And so I think that like our response to this as a community, we've got a long way to go in figuring out what's going to be most effective. Yeah. Do you know of any research about what's the most effective responses on a community or family level?
Not the research per se. I've done some help with a handful of different agencies after, first responders have taken their life by suicide, and helping with debriefings and helping with just consultation. But what we don't want to do, whether it's in a school or whether it's in a workplace of any type, is we need to be careful of what we say. What's our message? We need to be careful of the memorialization, because do we want to honor it too much? I don't think that's right. Do we want to disparage it? Do we want to say that it's weak or cowardly or completely selfish? Which really, the definition of selfish is that we're looking out for others. And kind of, Josh, like you said earlier, people think that they're the burden. So it's really not selfish on one way.
For sure.
It's selfish because we're the ones getting hurt, or we see other people and we think, okay, that's selfish because you're hurting everybody around you. But the people who take their life by suicide aren't thinking that. They're not thinking straight. They're not thinking it's selfish. So we got to be careful what our message is. We need to be careful that when somebody takes their life by suicide, it amplifies opportunities for other people to do it. And I guarantee that if you have an organization, a school, or whatever, a community, that somebody takes their life by suicide and they hear about it, 100% guarantee that there's other people that are now thinking of it even more. So we call it, the copycat thing. It's like, okay, now what am I going to do to help prevent that? So prevention post-suicide is super important to take a look at in your organization, in your family, in whatever. And to your point, Shara, to say, well, if I just had a family member who took their life by suicide, instead of just focusing on the pain and the burden that we feel or the loss, well, that's normal. We need to also say, how is everybody else feeling? We don't want anybody else to take their life.
Yeah.
Okay, so breaking it down, if I see this in a loved one, if I see this in myself, if I see this in a community member, maybe even post incident or post suicide, what do I do? And it's probably different if I'm noticing these things in myself versus I'm noticing those things in a brother, right? But if I'm noticing these things in myself or another, like, what are my options? What should I do? What's best case scenario?
Well, first, I think we need to talk about self. Here's the thing. It's ultra hard to have the courage to get help.
Big time.
Yeah.
Now, there are some people, and some people who call 911 all the time, and some people who might call 988 all the time, who will say, yeah, I'm just going to do it again. They might be a constant caller, but they're the anomaly. The people who are really suffering, who've never used that might be, okay, how do I make that first step to call 988? How do I make that first step to pick up the phone and make an appointment with a mental health counselor? How do I just tell a friend or a loved one that I'm really not in a good place? That is a scary place for people.
Super scary. It takes tons of bravery to step out and just admit that that's what's going on.
And I think part of it goes back to, okay, why? And it's the fear. It's a fear of people will look at me differently. People will treat me differently. I might lose my job. I might be labeled as crazy or whatever. And in reality, we need to just normalize it. We need to connect with people to say, hey, there are other people who get it. There are other people who understand, to normalize those feelings and then offer those resources. And really, that's just loving people. And it's hard to do that for yourself. So one of the things I often talk about is when I teach public safety, peer support, or different stuff, or other people, I said, look, you need to have the same rules for yourself as you would for others, because what if somebody was in your exact same shoes right now and they felt the exact same way you would? What advice would you give to them? And usually it's very compassionate and kind, but we're not compassionate and kind to ourselves. Mm-hmm. We're like, well, I'd tell them to get help, and I wouldn't look at them differently. I'd say they're okay, just let's get help. Okay, why aren't you doing that for yourself?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, to the point that you're saying, really what you're saying is this is something that we want to be aware of and support others and, be that rock that other people need. But at the same time, this is a personal decision. And to some extent, it's got to be you personally that steps out and says, hey, look, this is what's going on for me. Because if you don't, no one can help. There is no space for you to get help unless you can admit first that there's a problem.
Right. And I think a lot of people know, okay, well, what's going to happen? And fear of the unknown is huge. And that might drive that anxiety and depression or whatever, all those feelings. We use those words quite frequently, but really that's what it is, an overwhelming grief. I liken it to a giant magnifying glass of negative emotions, just amplifying all those negative emotions. But part of it is, okay, well, what's going to happen? What is going to happen if I tell somebody I'm actually suicidal? Am I going to be locked up? And so knowing what's going to happen is important. So let's say somebody calls 988 and you talk through it. That's okay. That's good. But what happens if they call 911? So first, I was talking to somebody, and I've talked with hundreds of people. One of the examples is that, an adult son was grabbing a gun and holding it around and whipping the gun around, talking about, I'm just going to kill myself then. Well, we need to make the scene or the person safe. And somebody just in a situation like that, that's totally unsafe. In fact, we need to make the situation safe. That might be a situation where we call 911. Okay? Now, police will always, the call taker and dispatchers will always gauge that, but I've responded as a police officer to numerous calls. And some people say, well, what's going to happen when the police get there? Well, guess what? They're just going to talk. They're going to try to help you. Now, unfortunately, there are some situations where it's like turns into, well, I'm going to just aim this gun at a police officer so I can die. And that's truly not fair to the police officers. I've had many friends who've had to kill people because people have done that. That's just not it's awful. It adds a burden to somebody else. We call it suicide by cop, but you fast forward that or change the scenario, it's like, okay, just want to get you help. That's it. Now, if somebody's in a situation where they need to get, involuntarily committed or taken to the hospital, that might happen. Mm-hmm. It's like if there's enough evidence to say, okay, there's somebody who just needs to be transported to the hospital, we'll get somebody to the hospital. Police and EMS, fire, they'll get somebody to the hospital and they'll transfer them. If you are a loved one that's in a situation like that, you can get them to the hospital. Here's the thing, though. There's a space between, okay, there's somebody who's an immediate danger to themselves right now. Okay, they can get involuntarily committed. In the state of Utah, it's called pink sheeted. Okay, so they can get involuntarily committed. But then there's some people who are like, well, I'm not going to kill myself, but I also don't want to live. I'm in a really bad space. I've talked to people who've gone up to check themselves in the hospital, and then they said, well, we're not going to check you in. But I don't want to live anymore, but I'm not going to kill myself. Well, then just go home. So there's that space in between. It's like, okay, we need to get somebody help quickly. And unfortunately, we just don't know exactly what that space in our culture. We don't have something really good right there to help those people in that in-between stage. And part of it might be, okay, well, let's go to counseling. Okay, so what about you go to counseling one week, and then if you make an appointment for the next week, gosh, what are they doing the entire time? They've said they're not going to kill themselves, but they're also really, really not in a good space. Mm-hmm. So, and that can be difficult. So whether it's intensive outpatient or, some inpatient, but they might not be accepted into it. So anyway, I digress, but I think it's important to just kind of note that those things it's kind of a conundrum of life, but we need to connect with other people. We need to get with people who understand. And with 988, there's crisis response teams in every county, that a mobile crisis response. So a mental health counselor or you could call what's called a warm line, or they could transfer you to somebody who's basically a peer who's done well and worked through things, and you can talk to them, and they might come out too on a mobile response to just sit and help. Because if somebody's not going to take their life, law enforcement can only be there so long, but we could say, hey, we're sorry, we feel bad, hang in there. But we can try to connect them with community resources.
I'm really glad that you addressed that, because I actually had a phone call, I think it was earlier this week, it might have been last week. And I think my experience is probably similar to your guys's from the clinical standpoint. Obviously, I can't speak as a police officer, but if you reach out, our goal is to not send, people always call it the psych ward, right? I'm going to go to the hospital because I'm crazy. And the reality is our goal is to actually help you not have some of those rights taken from you. We want to help stabilize the situation. And it also sounds like that's what the cops' first line of defense is too. They're going to show up and they're going to try and de-escalate the situation rather than jump into it. But you're right, there is a barrier in services, which is if I can't get into the hospital, what resources are available to me? And I think you hit the nail on the head with a couple of those options there. The 988, if you have a team, and most of us in this room have worked for the county, and they do have teams that will come to your home, again, with the goal of de-escalating. I'm really glad that you hit on that. So if somebody is feeling overwhelmed, whether it's 988, 911, calling a mental health professional, calling the county response team, everybody's really going to try and show up for the benefit of the person. Our first line isn't to lock somebody up.
Yeah. Although, if I could put a little bit of a plug in for hospitalization, I mean, obviously that's not what people want to have happen. But on the other hand, if you were having any kind of medical crisis and you had to go to the hospital for help, right? You broke your leg, you got to have somebody fix your leg. You would go to the hospital. Would you love it? No, you wouldn't love it. But you would go and you would get some of the treatment that you need so that you could get on your path to healing. And I would say that we need to frame the hospital a little bit more like that. If somebody is having an emergency, a mental health emergency, going to the hospital is a good option.
I'm so glad you said
it's
that.
the right
Absolutely.
option, right? Because go to the hospital. If you are actively suicidal, go to the hospital. And is it going to be a fun stay? No. It's not.
It's not a fun stay if you broke your leg and you're stuck there either.
Right.
Sure.
Still not a fun stay. But can you get some of the help that you need, some of the immediate stabilization so that you can get to the point where you actually can get back out and into your life and following up with somebody like a mental health counselor? Absolutely.
I'm so glad
I think all of these options are they're good options. This isn't a perfect system, but it's what we've got. And there is help out there. It's not that one of these options is a bad option, right? It's what we've got, and it's what we've got to work with. And there are people out there who really do want to help and who are trained to help, right?
I like it. I think there's a lot of people walking around with emotional amputations, and if you're that person, recognize that it's an injury. We need to go to the hospital. I like what you said, but we still look at it like, well, maybe if I was missing my arm, maybe I would feel better for not feeling the way I feel. So we feel bad, and then we feel bad for feeling bad, and then it just compounds itself.
Yeah.
Right.
I know I've had to use that. I used to work a lot with schizophrenia, which you said was one of those populations that's potentially at a higher risk for suicidal ideation. Man, the hospital, it's just another tool in the tool bag. You can't build an entire house with a hammer. Sometimes you need a screwdriver. Sometimes you need a set of pliers. And there are times when the hospital is the appropriate response.
Speaking of populations, I think maybe we should jump into that a little bit, because I'm a veteran of Iraq. I remember somebody in the unit I was with before going over there took their life. In the unit that was replacing us, as soon as they came into country, then they received ammo, somebody killed themselves. So in just looking at different populations, I think, okay, what age does somebody take their life? What gender? What the LGBTQ are at high risk for taking their life by suicide. So, we already talked a little bit about the first responders. Yeah, they're super high risk for for suicide and suicidality. And then, but you look at what else drives that. It could be a lot. We can look at a high ACEs scores or adverse childhood experiences. That actually can drive some suicidality as well. Alcoholism, that definitely will do it. Drug use, definitely. And psychosis can happen from drug use. In fact, with marijuana and the various things with marijuana nowadays, the THC and the different levels of dab and everything else that has come to that, even smoking one time can cause psychosis. So if you want, you're this massive paranoia or, hallucinations and auditory hallucinations and other things, which mimic schizophrenia, you gotta stay away from drugs.
Yeah.
It's an awful, awful, horrible thing. And the amount of people that I've talked to who want to kill themselves because of psychosis, whether it's schizophrenia or drug-induced psychosis, or whether it stays forever, it's huge, huge.
Yeah. One of the things too because you've mentioned substance use quite a few times, and I think that lots of times people are using substance use to try to manage whatever mental health issue they have. But one of the things that we don't realize is that when we have some kind of a substance on board in our bodies, it does make us more likely to do something like take our own life because our judgment is so impaired. And I've seen some research about how, because for someone to take their life, they have to overcome this innate thing inside of us that makes us live, right? This will to live, like you have to overcome that. And to do that, really, if you have some kind of substance on board your body, it's much more likely you'll come to that point.
Yes, I think the whole reason that somebody uses is just to escape from the pain, but unfortunately, it's going the wrong direction.
I think it's also worth noting that as you list some of these populations, the truth is nobody gets away from suicidal thoughts. They can happen to anyone in any socioeconomic status, substance use or not, mental health conditions or not. And so, Jeff, we appreciate you being here.
Yeah.
We certainly appreciate you coming in and sharing some information with us. I think suicide is something that's very important, and it's obviously passionate to those of us who work in the field. And we got to figure out how to best respond, whether we're just a citizen that's not a social worker or mental health counselor or a professional in some sort. But thanks for coming on and sharing some of your thoughts with us.
Yeah.
We appreciate it.
I just want to wrap up with that. If we're going to close, I got to say this. If you or a loved one, if you suspect somebody's going to kill themselves or take a life by suicide, don't ask, hey, are you going to harm yourself? Because that might be superficial. Ask direct questions. Are you thinking about killing yourself? Are you going to kill yourself or take your life by suicide? And then if they say yes, you stay with them and get them help. You want to know how and you want to know when. Those are the keys. If they say no, they say no. Now, could they lie? Yep.
Yeah.
And I've had people lie to me. Then they kill themselves the next day. I'm like, oh, they were really, really saying no in a big way. But we can't control what other people do. And let me just say one last thing. I think I had a friend years ago who responded to an overturned vehicle that had been hit by a drunk driver. He was an ambulance driver. It was his wife, his newlywed wife, and her best friend. She was trapped underneath the car, upside down. He got on his stomach and was trying to help her stay alive. And she was alive, but she was ebbing quickly. They tried to extract her. They couldn't extract her. And she finally died. She passed away. He told me, he said, I tried to kill myself. And he said, I'm not going to tell you how or why I know, but he said, I didn't kill myself because angels are real. I believe that his deceased wife came to him and appeared to him. Now, it doesn't always mean that that heaven's going to intervene or that there's going to be divine intervention or any other intervention, but the intervention is between you and me. We're angels in the flesh that we can help other people. We just got to care for other people. Again, help them know they're not alone. Connect with them. Help them feel normal. And get them for resources so we can help other people.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good plug, because each of us has an ability to influence the life of somebody else. Thank you.
Thanks.
That's awesome.
Thanks.
Well, I'm sure I speak for all of us when we say we're really glad that you wanted to come on. You bugged us enough to make us actually motivated to do it. But we're glad you came, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this. We hope that something here was helpful. We'll leave all the helpful links and numbers we talked about in the description of the video if you feel like you or someone else you know needs help. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks.
Thanks.